So when it comes to geometry terminology, this stuff can be super overwhelming. When I first started, I remember there just being, it felt like an overwhelming amount of different terminology and lingo that people were using. And this chapter is really meant to break down the main terminology. There's plenty that we're not going to list here, but if you get to know these, you'll be starting off on the right foot. So this chapter is meant to be something that you can refer back to as you progress. You're not expected to be a master of all this terminology right out of the box, but we'll go through these one by one and kind of explain them. So the first one's going to be just vertex, edge, and face. So these are going to be probably the ones that you are most familiar with at this point, if you've done any kind of modeling inside of Blender. So this is not meant to be a follow-along chapter, so I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. Verts right here, so just single points. Edges is going to be consisting of 2 or more points, and then faces are going to be consisting of 3 or more points right there. Polygons or quads, so these are going to be faces. So the third category right there, face, there's going to be polygons or quads. Same with tris and n-gons. So all of these things right here are going to be faces. So a polygon is going to be a face with 4 different edges. So 1, 2, 3, 4. A triangle is going to be a face with 3 different edges. 1, 2, 3 right there. And then an n-gon is going to be a face with 5 or more edges. So this is an n-gon right here. We have 1, 2, and 16 different edges that make of this surface. So we'll get into in the next chapter about pros and cons of these things. I'm just going to focus on terminology in this chapter. Loops, so these are going to be edge loops, face loops, and vert loops. So these are going to be things like this, where we have a loop that goes around here. So this right here is an edge loop. This right here is going to be a face loop. And then this right here is going to be a vert loop. Next up, we have the normals. So the normals are going to be primarily to do with the shading of this object. So for here, this is what we call like smooth normals. This is going to be hardened normals. So things like this. So basically controlling the way it's looking in terms of, is it hard or is it soft? And then if we want to actually display the normals here, we can actually display this 2 different ways. So we can do this way right here, and then face orientation right here. So blue is going to be the direction that the normal is facing. So if we actually go inside of here, it'll be red, which is going to be the opposite. So non-planar polygons. So these are going to be to do with surfaces like this, where we have a polygon, but it's not flat. And the reason why this is important, because a polygon, a quad, is always made up of 2 different triangles. You're not necessarily working with it as a triangle, but at render time, it all gets converted over to triangles. And you can see this here, a triangle right there. And I have the triangle modifier on right here, so you can actually see it right there. It's actually made up of that. So that becomes important whenever you're starting to get into modeling. We have things like non-manifold geometry. So again, we'll get into the good and bad of this stuff in the next chapter. But non-manifold essentially refers to a surface that isn't easily flattened, or essentially it can be problematic in terms of applying modeling operations. So some things like UVs, some polygon modeling operations won't work on them. And there's a couple of different scenarios that define a non-manifold geometry, but non-manifold, you can think of it as just kind of broken geometry. So like this, for example, this edge right here is sharing 3 different faces. So 1, 2, and 3. That's a non-manifold geometry. And we'll talk about the pros and cons of that in the next chapter. And then this is going to be another non-manifold where we have 1 vert sharing 4 edges, but only 2 polygons. That's also a non-manifold geometry. And then this one, we have, if we actually display the face orientation, you can see that this is going to be displaying the blue and then the red over here. So this means we have a flipped normal over here, which then makes it a non-manifold geometry. So some modeling operations that you might use might not work on this. Next up, we have poles. So this is just going to be referring to anytime you have a bunch of triangles connecting right here in the center, like that. Very, very common on cylinders. Polygon density, that just has to do with, so if I display this right here, you can see that this mesh right here is really, really dense down here, but not up here. So that's polygon density. So just more resolution down there is what creating that different density. And then topology. So these last couple, we're going to start to get into the non-manifold, the poles, the polygon density, and topology. We're going to get into the pros and cons of this in the next chapter, But just to break down what topology is and why we need to worry about it. If you see a surface like this and you see a surface like this, they look the same, but they're rendering weird. That's because this one has good topology. These two, not so much. Topology becomes important for, rendering, subdividing, deforming, and, oftentimes getting your 3D data to other packages. But the primarily ones are going to be just subdivision and your normals when you're first starting out. So does it look good when it's rendering, basically? So that wraps that up. And again, don't expect to be a master at all this terminology right off the bat. And I definitely recommend, as you progress, refer back to this chapter.